I just want to give a few words about the Centre of Gravity series itself. Firstly, to the editor of this series, McCallum Johnson, who has been indefatigable and prescient in bringing this together over a number of months and also putting together this webinar. So thank you very much, McCallum. And also, just for the awareness of those who might not be familiar with the series, this is a really important initiative, I think, in bridging academia and the worlds of policy. And also taking some of the conversations about security out of the so-called Canberra bubble and into the more mainstream debate. And so that's why it's exciting to be doing a webinar tonight and having speakers from all across Australia, because we really have taken this outside of just the Canberra elite and are bringing in some geographic diversity as well to the conversation. So without further ado, we've promised a number of fresh takes on security, and the first that we want to spotlight this evening is Sara Davies, who is a professor at the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith, and also an adjunct associate professor at the Gender, Peace and Security Centre at Monash University. And Sara will take us through how national security is affected by public health emergencies, including crises like COVID-19, and provide some policy reflections on how Australia can improve its efforts, particularly in the region, to sustain and strengthen regional health security. So Sara, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you so much, Katherine, for the invitation and for hosting me. I really would like to sincerely thank McCallum as well for the excellent work that was done with this collection of papers. I'd also like to sincerely congratulate the authors as well for really outstanding collection. And so I hope all of you listening do take the time to go through the link and have a look at the papers. They really are a great group of people to be publishing with, and I feel really privileged to be part of it. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I stand today, which is the Turrbal people. So COVID-19 is the pandemic that virologists had been warning politicians, fellow scientists, academics like myself for the last 3 decades at least. But when I wrote this piece, COVID-19 was not yet here. And by the time of publication, on the 24th of February, I have the email from McCallum and Andrew, who I'd also like to thank, asking if I could refer to the COVID situation. And so I thought I would add my little blurb that I added at the end of the paper, so spoilers alert. I added, the outbreak of COVID-19 illustrates the importance of peacetime regional coordination and diplomacy devoted to health security. Strong and equitable health systems is vital to achieve regional health security. But even the strongest system must work within a regional trade and travel system. Thus, it's important to invest in relationships before the crisis, to build channels of trust, communication, and information sharing between states, healthcare actors, and citizens. National security is a state-centric concern. Of course it is. The health of an individual is determined by the state, by income, how we think about gender as a society, how we think about race, human rights. These can affect our health outcomes. And then, of course, there are individual factors, diet, exercise, genetics. If you think about a society's view on sexual and reproductive rights, it dramatically affects the positive or negative life expectancy of girls and women. So the health spectrum is quite broad, and that can lead to sometimes this sense that it can be unfocused. It can be quite difficult to then think about it in a way that is directed and targeted compared to what we may see as the more simple or narrow gaze of national security. But I think as these papers show, and as you know, this outbreak is currently revealing, there's nothing narrow or simple about what is the national interest and how we think about national security and that interest test. It's constructed, it's politically manipulated, it's determined by our socioeconomic structures, as well as those random black swan events that can totally uptail what we think about in terms of our national security. And so in this paper, I was really interested in how do we, at the time, start to think about identifying why health security is an important area to be uppermost in our minds when thinking about what is our national security interest, but also uppermost in our minds when thinking about our relationships with our regional partners. So I think about in this paper how we think about, or how we could think about Australia's health security from a defence posture, but also from a foreign policy position. The Department of Defence white papers from the last decade have only referred to health in humanitarian assistance contexts and disaster relief contexts. The primary focus in these papers was on regional security, the Indo-Pacific, and they tended to approach health from a mix of two positions: proactive cooperation, largely around training and identifying partners in the region to improve humanitarian response in emergencies. And that was certainly the second part of the focus, a proactive humanitarian response in emergencies. So disease outbreak events, such as what we've seen with COVID-19, but even the type that I talk about in the paper, such as the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo last year, that's still ongoing today, are not the ones that tended to be the focus in a lot of those papers. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade position emerged with some clarity on health security in 2017. And this was after a number of years of relatively low-level talk about health security in the policy documents that were being prepared at the time. No doubt it was triggered by the West Africa Ebola outbreak in 2014, which was seen as quite a shock for the way in which we as regions thought about how safe we were from the arrival of pathogens such as the Ebola outbreak. But this white paper in 2017 primarily identified health security, again in the Indo-Pacific context, and as a national priority, and created the Indo-Pacific Centre for Regional Health Security. So what I identify at this point in the paper is that we do see consensus across our two primary regional and global outward-looking departments that regional health security does matter. For the Department of Defence, though, health security tends to be that humanitarian endeavour that responds to the crisis. But the benefit there is that it secures regional stability and security after the event. For DFAT, it is definitely a diplomatic opportunity to align the region in an area with trade and research benefits. And the rest of the paper, I talk about how we could maybe start to bring those two positions together to build a more substantive regional health security position for the Australian government. I identify three areas that we need to think about in terms of deepening the already important but tenuous steps that we've taken to link regional health security to our national interest. First, I suggest that we need to broaden our network of regional health security. I argue, I think a bit controversially in the paper, deliberately perhaps, that Indo-Pacific needs to think about and engage with the East African continent. It's important for a number of reasons. We have some other very strong states in the region who are already starting to identify health diplomacy, particularly China, as an area where they could be quite proactive. And they have already been seeking to make those types of investment in relationships in the sub-Saharan African continent. I think that it's important to note actually that in the Department of Defence papers, there is discussions in 2016 moving forward that focusing on bringing in the East African continent into thinking about cooperation and training is an important area. And I argue health security is one in particular where we could be thinking about this. We need to think about it because of the technical, research, geostrategic and economic benefits that come for our defence, for our Department of Defence, but also for our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in terms of thinking about how we can proactively engage in training and partnership. In the second part of the second argument that I make, where I think is particularly relevant at the moment, is the importance of deepening the work of the Indo-Pacific Centre for Health Security. And I'm happy to take questions on this. I'll deal with it very briefly here because I'm conscious of time. I think in light of COVID, there's need to accelerate the ambition of this centre. Australia has the potential, based on its past efforts in the post-SARS crisis and the H1N1, which could have been the influenza pandemic that we were all concerned about, to build and expand regional partnerships through the efforts of health diplomacy. This is not because our region doesn't have problems with trust, transparency, and capacity, but precisely because our region has such variations in trust, transparency, and capacity that we need to actually invest diplomatically through health diplomacy in the normalisation of regular contact, regular communication, and regular cooperation to build and prepare for a cooperative, functional response to insecurity and outbreak situations. And I think it's particularly important to look at the moment in our region about our partners who we have developed strong bilateral but also regional partnerships, and to think about what we could be doing more in this space at the moment. Finally, I think it's really important that we combine the humanitarian assistance focus of our defence forces and training and cooperation in the region with the diplomatic efforts of the Centre for Health Security. And in particular here, I'm thinking about there was an ambition articulated in 2015 and again in 2017 that I don't think we've really seen capitalise on yet, and that is deepening community-focused healthcare worker development and training in the region. I here refer to in the paper the work of the Australian Medical Assistance Team and the National Critical Care and Trauma Response Centre as two really good examples where humanitarian and emergency response and training has been happening. And I recommended in the paper that there's a need to turn that focus to pandemic response and training across a range of areas, from risk communication to contact tracing to the type of focal point response training that needs to happen within governments. There's a need in our region to think about, in particular, the first healthcare worker responders who may sometimes be low on the hierarchical chain, but as we've seen in this outbreak, very important, very crucial individuals for being the people who collect, identify, and trace the sources of potential infection. They can sometimes, particularly in our politically fragile locations, be very important individuals to give insight into what is happening on the ground. So I want to conclude by arguing that we can do so much more in this space, and we need to. Defence partnerships with civil actors, of course, need to be managed very carefully. And I know in this environment, we're not going to see masses of money available, but investment in local and national training, in civilian and defence cooperation, in the diplomacy around health cooperation is vital to secure positive and strong health system results for our individuals and our states. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. From one conversation about how we need to widen the lens on what constitutes security, straight into another on how we can broaden and deepen the constituency involved in debates about strategic studies, led by Susan Harris-Rimmer, who is an associate professor at the Griffith University Law School and also deputy head of school there. Susan, over to you.
Thank you. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am, which is the Jagera and Turrbal people, but also the Ngunnawal people in Canberra, where the ANU is, and the traditional owners of the lands wherever everyone's joining us from. I honour our elders, and I say this with particular impact today because First Nations wisdom is part of the diversity which I'm calling for when it comes to national security debates, as I'll get to. So I was so delighted to be in this project. I'm so grateful to McCallum and to Andrew and to all involved, partly because I'm a huge admirer of the other authors. If you haven't read Sara Davies' book on containing contagion, you are missing out. It's extraordinary. Talk about prescient research. So it's wonderful to be, it's often a bit lonely being a feminist security scholar. It's probably going to shock you, but it's true. So it's lovely to be amongst this wonderful group of people. And I suppose because it was someone I trust, Dr. Andrew Carr, who invited me to engage in this project, I thought, what kind of crazy, brave thing should I do? I thought, oh no, I'll take on Professor Hugh White. Yeah, because he's only written, you know, the most important book forever in national security, and I'll just have a red hot go at it. So the reason I was tempted to do this, I suppose, is because I hadn't seen my particular views reflected anywhere else. And I suppose I was very interested in thinking to myself, I was getting angry at one stage because even though it was so widely commented on, it was quite a narrow group of voices, I felt, that were commenting on it. And I thought, well, you know, if you want to complain, you better step up, Sue. So I thought I would try to do my best response to Hugh White, and I shared it with him before publication in some trepidation. You'll be happy to know he disagreed with absolutely everything I said, except for the point about more diversity in security debates. So my point was that Hugh White's book is brilliant. It's definitely something you should read. How to Defend Australia is a really important book. And it's important because it talks about independent defence policy that is built on a first principles, historically informed, but fresh take, a fresh perspective on what should the structure of our defence capability look like and what should be the nature of our alliances. It's a very deep-rooted and very interesting book, and Hugh is a very logical and rational person. It's beautifully set out. It's accessible, I think, for those of us who are not as versed in force structure debates as others, right? So it offers an opportunity into those sorts of debates. So I believe that his purpose of the book is extremely important, and the idea about how to think about defence spending and how best to decide how to spend our defence spending is a really worthy topic of debate. So where I parted company with the idea of the book is that Hugh is very focused on kinetic and traditional armed conflict, and he's very focused on interstate armed conflict, and a lot of the book is predicated on Indonesia and China, and that came through a lot in the interviews that Hugh White did around the book. And while that is extremely important, and I pretty much agree with his analysis of the interstate conflict points, I felt there wasn't enough weight given to non-traditional security threats. We wrote this again last year, around November, I believe it was finished. So while I was calling for climate change, I couldn't have predicted the bushfires as well as the pandemic. But they're all in there in the book as likely non-traditional threats. So if I was, so it was a point I wanted to make about our threat assessments as well, that our threat assessments have to change. We have to start being more creative and thinking about existential threats to Australian security through a different type of lens that takes into account the empiric reality of the world we are living in, which is rapidly changing. So I was making a plug for multi-level hybrid threat assessments as well. So my main argument in this is that we do know, we have the kind of the beginning of evidence that climate change is at least a force multiplier or a risk multiplier. It's not as direct as we thought, but the latest Nature research is showing that it could up to 5 times multiply the risk and duration and intensity of armed conflict. So it is a factor we have to take into account. We also have to take into account that with cascading disasters, the military are the only ones resourced with kind of logistical resources that we have. And we knew this before the bushfires, that no one else had the kind of logistical capability to deal with large-scale disasters in Australia except for the ADF. So I argue in the paper for a dual-use military. Also, the ADF is written into the National Pandemic Strategy in quite an important and fundamental way. So these are big questions we have to have. We haven't seen them deployed as much as they could be, but if there was a vaccine in limited quantity, you would see the ADF more deployed than they are at the moment. So that was the first point, that we need to think about non-traditional security threats. We need a more human security lens, and we need a different type of threat assessment that would help us deal with those types of threats. The second point, which is a very serious, almost visceral reaction on my part. So the force restructure arguments that Hugh makes are around, Graham DeBell calls it like this, so I've written it down. I like it: sink the Navy and start again, shrink the Army, double the Air Force. You know, it's really radical what he's asking, and he's also asking for a spend roughly about 4% of GDP to make that work. But he says to defend the territorial integrity of Australia, we would need to invest in nuclear-tipped submarines, similar to some of our allies. And so that is another place where we part company. I believe strategic choices still have limits, and those limits are, in my discipline, international law. And so I felt that any type of move in that direction would weaken our otherwise strong position as a supporter of the rules-based order as a middle power. And instead, I argued we should actually get behind the treaty to ban nuclear weapons. So I do not agree with their nuclear weapon option, which is because I'm heavily involved in organisations like the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, who have always stood against, and ICANN, who always stood against nuclear, the nuclear option. But also about the spending. So I'm arguing that that sort of spending is better spent on preventative diplomacy and conflict prevention, climate response, than on the nuclear option, which may not work. So finally, my final argument in my last minute is really thinking about this constituency. So I thought, let's go for it. Let's argue for the biggest thing I can think of. And I want a very wide, very deep debate on whether Australia should declare neutrality, like other nations like Ireland and Singapore, credible nations, as an example. And this idea of a dual-use defence force, let's have a debate that is broader than the usual, I suppose, security scholar and security practitioner area. So I make some points in there, particularly about gender, but it works for quite a range of diversity. These issues are so important that we need everything we have in order to address them, all the talent we have. So I suppose that what I'm calling for here is exactly what the centre of gravity is modelling, that sometimes you need, I don't think there's ever been a centre of gravity with an all-female readership before. I produced the first all-female security challenges journal last year. It wasn't, didn't, hurt the sky or anything. It was fine, everything was fine. But they're rare. They're still very rare to have. And that's just gender, let alone any other types of diversity. So I think we have to try a little bit harder to hear different voices, counterfactuals, and increase the contestation around some of these national security debates. There is an appetite for it, I must say. People are really interested in hearing counterfactuals and contestation in all kinds. Professor White loves it. So he wasn't at all mad at me, which was really, really good. So this is a call to say, please get involved in these kinds of debates, make your voice heard, and let's widen the pool of voices from which we're pulling these kinds of discussions. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks, Susan. And already some questions are starting to come in to the side as well. So thanks for that, and keep it coming. We'll now go to Clare Higgins, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law at UNSW, and also an affiliate scholar in Georgetown in Washington, DC, at their Institute for the Study of International Migration. Clare will talk about Australia's securitised approach to asylum and refugee policy, and perhaps talk about ways in which we can expand resettlement pathways.
Thank you very much, Katherine, and thank you to McCallum and the whole team for this event and for bringing this issue together. I'd like to echo Sara and Susan's praise for the quality of this issue and how exciting it is to have a prismatic view of security issues from a very fresh perspective. So as Katherine said, I've sought to reframe our view of what security means in the context of refugee policy, Australia's refugee policy. And so that means, in my piece, human security, refugee protection, and international peace and security. So states like Australia working in cooperation to share responsibility for addressing displacement. Now, in practice, that kind of reframing means stepping back from Australia's current policy approach, which relies very heavily on deterrence measures of asylum seekers, and instead recognising that forced migration is an ongoing global phenomenon that requires a cooperative, protection-centred and sustainable approach to managing entry. Deterrence measures such as offshore processing and boat turnbacks leave very little flexibility with which to respond to humanitarian situations. Boat turnbacks shift responsibility onto other states in our region that are hosting many thousands of displaced people already. So these practices are unilateral responses to a phenomenon that is highly complex. I think I echo what Sara said in her presentation, which was there's nothing narrow or simple about these kind of security questions. Now, I should note that a protection-centred approach to refugee policy doesn't mean relinquishing control over entry. In fact, in 2016, the UN General Assembly affirmed unanimously that states have rights and responsibilities to manage and control their borders in a way that upholds international refugee and human rights law obligations. So Australia can protect both refugees and the nation's security interests. My recommendation for how this can happen in the paper is, as Katherine said, that Australia can expand safe pathways for the admission of asylum seekers and refugees. And this would support Australia's goal of ensuring that asylum seekers don't have to get on boats and not drawn into potentially exploitative people smuggling networks and not forced to take potentially dangerous journeys at sea. Expanding safe admission pathways is an urgent priority for the international community. It's a core objective of a new agreement that's called the Global Compact on Refugees that was adopted in late 2018 by Australia and 180 other states. Expanded pathways means, for example, expanded resettlement under Australia's annual humanitarian program. Currently, Australia accepts just over 18,000 people, refugees and other humanitarian entrants. It's one of around 30 countries that has a program of that kind. We might see headline figures of 70 million people displaced this year, but it's worth noting and taking into account that not all those people will need or best benefit from resettlement. In fact, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has identified about 1.4 million people, so a relatively smaller number, who would best benefit from third country resettlement in 2020. So Australia, having very sophisticated and experienced settlement services in place, along with other states, is well equipped to contribute to that goal. Expanded pathways also means opening up non-humanitarian migration channels like skilled visas for refugees and others. Australia has piloted this approach recently with some success, and so it's hoped that that pilot scheme can now translate into something bigger and permanent. When these measures, these expanded admission pathways, operate as a complement to national asylum procedures, they can have strategic benefits that go beyond the benefits afforded to the individual refugee and the community in which that person settles in Australia. Increased admission to third countries like Australia can ease pressure in host countries, in frontline states that are, as I mentioned before, hosting many thousands of displaced people. And that in turn can improve conditions on the ground for those who don't move onward, for those who stay, perhaps making it easier for them to integrate locally, or with time and the improvement of conditions, voluntarily return home. So there are, of course, very obvious challenges in addressing global displacement. It's a complex issue, but Australia has the skills, resources and experience to contribute to international responsibility sharing and security in this policy area. Thank you.
Claire, thank you. And our penultimate speaker is a senior lecturer in international relations at Deakin and also a non-resident fellow at the Perth US Asia Centre, among other things, Danielle Chubb. And Danielle will look at how we can perhaps develop a more coordinated policy response to North Korea, which would also provide Australia with a reinvigorated analytical capacity to address human rights and security on the Korean Peninsula more broadly.
Thank you, Katherine, and thank you as well as others have said for the opportunity to be included in this paper. It was quite an honour to be included alongside such illustrious people as you're hearing from today. I've been, before I start, I also wanted to acknowledge the traditional lands of the people of the land where I live and work, the Wurundjeri people, but also because my ability to do research is based on my work at a multi-campus university, I always think it's nice to acknowledge that those campuses, that Deakin University's campuses, are built on traditional lands of the Wadawurrung people of the Geelong region, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of Melbourne region, and the Gunditjmara people of the Warrnambool region. So in the paper, I make what I think is actually quite a simple proposition. It's very cheap. It's very, very easy to put together. It probably has no direct costs attached to it, but and I think it would really enhance Australia's policy towards North Korea and allow Australia to play a more constructive role in the region when it comes to North Korea policy in general. So I start with the argument that was made, in fact, in a previous Centre of Gravity paper by Emma Campbell. And she argued there that Australia's approach to North Korea, that its weakness is that it's overly focused on North Korea's conventional and military capabilities, and little attention is given to sources of non-traditional security threats in the country, such as the country's economic and political weaknesses. So this forms a starting point for my paper, and I focus on one element of these issues, the human rights situation. And that's an issue that I have been looking at for, well, the better part of a decade and a half. And over that time, it has started to gain prominence in the international community among diplomats at the UN. And so I think it's really time for Australia to start talking about this issue. Apart from the moral exigency to act on this issue, which I think is a separate matter from what we're dealing with here, from a security perspective, North Korea's continual denial of basic rights and freedom to its population has to, I think, be understood as a central component of how that state is structured and the type of choices it makes. And what I mean by this is that its ability to exist, North Korea, really depends largely on diverting significant resources to its military program. And it does this, and at the same time is able to garner popular support for that, and also for other measures that may lead to sanctions and reductions in the quality of life. And the way it does this is by tightly controlling the information environment and repressing human rights. So Australia, I think, understands this. Australia has been very receptive to the Human Rights Commission report that the United Nations Commission of Inquiry published back in 2014. But I think that the problem with how Australia approaches the two issues of security in North Korea and human rights in North Korea is that it's unclear what Australia believes the relationship between these two issues is. I think that it is unclear what the relationship is, and I'm not trying to make an argument for what I think that relationship is. In fact, that's an issue that I would love to spend some time, if I had the resources, to look into, because it's a question I think that we don't actually have an answer to. But when it comes to how Australia deals with the issues, it answers to that question without giving it any really serious thought. So on the one hand, officially, they're treated separately by Australia. There are different policy mechanisms in place for dealing with the human rights situation in North Korea and for the nuclear situation, nuclear weapons program in North Korea, and the security situation. But there are also indications that Australia's government considers the issues linked. So in 2015, for example, while Australia was seated on the UN Security Council, Australia led a group of 10 other members to place the North Korean human rights issue on the agenda. And that was quite a significant, outcome for the human rights agenda. And when it did this, Australia argued, this is a quote from the Australian representative at the time, they said that the human rights violations in North Korea should be on the agenda because they threaten to have a destabilising impact on the region and the maintenance of international peace and security. So rhetorically, I think it's quite clear that Australia sees these two issues as linked. But if you look at the policy settings, there's nothing in place to help deal with that. And I think that matters because as a result of having no clear understanding of how to deal with that kind of overlap between the human rights and security situation, what you see is the question of whether and how to approach human rights questions in the context of a tense security environment, or at that matter at times of improved relations. And we saw a great deal of debate around these questions at the time of the summits between Trump and Kim Jong-un. As a result, that question hasn't been seriously considered, and debate tends to be highly politicized, and I think that's a really big problem. What we end up with is a tendency to bring up the human rights issue when relations with North Korea start to deteriorate. And what this does is give strength to North Korea's suspicion and their accusation that the international community is not actually worried about the plight of the North Korean people, but that human rights is part of a broader antagonistic, aggressive regime change agenda. So we need to be careful not to give the impression that we're using human rights as just another point of weakness when dealing with North Korea. And actually, I think we have to be careful not to do that. We don't have to worry just not about giving the impression that we're doing that, but I think we have to be careful not to do that because it's very easy to do. So what can Australia do? So what I argue, as I said, I think it's quite simple, is to establish a whole of government working group on human rights and security in North Korea. And this is important because this group would bring together individuals and teams in government already who are responsible for defence, for human rights, for North Korea and South Korea policy across the government. All these groups and individuals exist, but there's no mechanism for a wide consultation. And they should consult regularly, I argue, with a range of external experts as well, with the view to constantly seeing new and alternative ideas. And these external experts could operate through mechanisms already available to the government, through providing informal consultations. And I think we've all been part of those kinds of consultations in the past. And should also include civil society actors. And that's the last point I want to make, that I make in the paper, is that civil society actors are very important in this space because for a very long time, states were not interested in looking at the human rights situation in North Korea. And so this was up to the civil society, and they've been producing long and detailed reports for a very long time. And also the humanitarian sector has been working in North Korea continuously since the late 1990s, and some less continuously than others. And they also have their own perspectives on what should be done to improve the lives of North Korean people. And there's the UN field office in Seoul that's already grappling directly with how to bring together these sets of concerns. So Australia's embassy in Seoul does already a really good job at consulting with these sectors. They meet regularly with human rights actors, with UN field office, with humanitarian sector, and they would bring to this conversation, I think, really valuable insights. But instead, these insights tend to get lost within DFAT and don't make their way over to this kind of other broader conversations. So I'll stop there because I think there's plenty to go on there for a conversation.
Thanks, Danielle. Now, I realise at the beginning I didn't introduce myself. I'm Katherine Mansted. I am the Senior Advisor for Public Policy at the National Security College, and I'm very grateful to have been included in this series with my co-author, Sara Logan, who's a lecturer over at the International Relations School at ANU. And I'm the lucky last cab off the rank, and I'll keep this very brief because I want to get to some of the very interesting questions that have been posed. But in essence, we argue in our paper that data, and in particular citizen and personal data, how it's used, how it's collected, and how it is protected, should be considered to be a key concern for national security and indeed Australia's democracy. And that defence and national security agencies need to be thinking much more closely about citizen data than they have to this point. Our key recommendation is that the government should recognise data, both the ones and the zeros, but also the systems through which it's collected and transmitted, as critical infrastructure. As much to signal its importance to people, to government agencies and to the Parliament, as much as to trigger the special processes that would be in place if we thought of data as critical infrastructure. And I guess there are three things that motivate that recommendation, and also that I want to broadly reflect on, which tie in to what a lot of the other speakers this evening have been talking about. Three things, the first of which is this, that I think we're seeing a shift in national security from being something that the quote unquote elites or security agencies can deal with behind closed doors, to something that actually touches the lives of all people and all citizens, and therefore that all citizens have a stake in. Obviously, COVID-19, Australia's response to that pandemic is a case in point of that change. But also I think personal data and the way that it now has a geopolitical aspect is also a really important thing to reflect on. So when, for instance, the Australian Parliament was hacked last year and data was taken, when my university, the Australian National University, had experienced a hack by a sophisticated state actor last year as well, that's ordinary people's data, my data and many of my colleagues' data, that's being caught up in a geopolitical game. And increasingly we see state actors, and in particular actors like China, quite interested not just in state secrets and business secrets, which traditionally have been the domain of agents of state espionage, but also in individual and citizen data, which is a concern for civil liberties as much as it is for security. Because data will, on all accounts, be the most, or one of the most important drivers of economic growth over the next couple of decades. It's a very strategically important asset, and because of the extent to which it's collected now and its availability, it can also be used I guess, for strategic purposes, such as influence operations, blackmail, all of those usual things, but the aperture is expanded and it touches people's lives now. That's number one, that shift, so people really matter. The second one is, I think there are a lot of false dichotomies in Australia's national security debates. We see playing out at the moment, sometimes in my mind, a bit of a false dichotomy between the ideas of security or economic prosperity. You can either have one or the other, or indeed between security and safety and civil liberties. Invariably, they must trade off against each other. And I think another false dichotomy in the debate is between security and privacy. Often we think that in order to be more safe and secure, we need to give up some of those individual rights around privacy. And from a normative perspective, I don't buy that argument, because I think Robert Menzies said way back in the day when he was staring down the precipice of World War II, that it would be the worst loss, the worst defeat would be to win a war, but to lose ourselves in the process and to lose our liberty. So that's one point. But the other point is that when it comes to data, protecting data is a national security imperative because it is so strategically and economically important. We can't protect citizens' data. We can't make great gains in the business applications and in technologies like artificial intelligence and so forth of the future, which will be a key source of that prosperity. And we also open ourselves up to our systems being gamed and exploited by conspiracy groups, radical groups, and state actors who will use data and citizen data against us to achieve their political objectives. The final point is, I think, on the importance of trust in data and trust in data governance, and indeed trust in government, and how we need to see that as more of a strategic resource, as more of a national security concern than we ever have before. I noticed that Sian Troth is on this call from the Jeff Blyth Centre down in Adelaide, and she's done some great writing on the notion of trust as a strategic resource. And I really think that when it comes to the Australian government's ability to be trusted by the public, to collect our data and to use it in ways that we agree with and that protect privacy, protect civil liberties, keep it safe from foreign actors and from hacks, I think that is going to be also key. And indeed, Sarah and I argue in the paper that it will be key to our ability to navigate security challenges in the future. And I guess COVID is again kind of proving that point to some degree, because you need people to trust the government as a safe broker and a trusted pair of hands on things like the COVID Safe app. Because when it comes to a crisis and government suddenly needs to deploy some technology quickly and rely on trust, that trust needs to exist there already. So we argue that governments need to prioritise almost above all other things when it comes to systems of service delivery and, of course, the use of data by national security agencies, this notion of trust. And of course, key to that is protecting data, protecting it from loss, misuse, keeping the privacy there, because people, in general, statistics show are quite happy for government to use their data and quite happy for corporations to use their data, provided that use is done with their consent and in ways in which they can see how it's being done. There's a level of transparency and they trust that it won't get bungled and their data won't be misused. So that is my very quick summary of my and Sarah's paper. I did want to do that very quickly though, so that we could get onto some questions. So we'll now move to the Q&A phase. Firstly, thank you to all of our authors for those presentations, and the questions that roll in, keep them rolling in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can, although we probably won't get to all of them. Our first question is actually from Anonymous, which is to Susan on the notion of your dual use ADF. The question is, if we have or is a dual use ADF feasible or desirable? Should we not just have an ADF for high-end warfighting and then some type of civil defence for the other things that the ADF might need to combat? And I might throw in someone else's question there, which I think is linked, which is from Michelle Smith, which says, why should we even have some of these high-end war fighting capabilities like submarines if we're never going to use them? Why don't we just invest in some of the non-traditional things such as peacekeeping?
These are all such difficult decisions for a nation to have. So on the dual use issue, I suppose my point was that no one else has the logistical capability at present. And I think Tom pointed out in the chat, there's been some wonderful work done by an ADF scholar called Mark Armstrong around the bushfire call out, and I'm sure there'll be some thinking about the pandemic call out as well and the use of the reserves. Actually, the constitutional position around aid to the civil power is a little bit murky. So we have a legal issue as well. And that legal issue is extremely important because we don't necessarily want a defence force that is focused domestically. Always the premise of our system has been that the defence force, civilian controlled, operates externally, is only called in to give aid to the civil power under examples of extreme duress, and then there's various protocols that have to be followed, but actually they're not very clear. So one of the things we need is a bit of constitutional debate around some of these issues. So I suppose I'm the last person to say that we would love the defence to get more involved in domestic affairs. I think it's extremely dangerous. I think our position in the region will tell you that's a terrible way to go, but I cannot see any way at the moment where I mean, what we can't have is this extreme where our first responders are volunteers, right? Which is kind of where we're at, even in the health or lower paid people who are unappreciated. Our healthcare workers, our bushfire volunteers, people on the cutting edge of our emergencies at the moment are not sufficiently valued and protected. So we can't have that. And then in the other direction, you have what a lot of people in the ADF think is a diversion from their purpose, which is to defend Australia's borders externally. So we've got to find somewhere that would help, because the government just keeps calling the ADF out and it's happening more regularly. So we have to deal with this. We can't just simply have a theoretical debate anymore. It has become extremely immediate. So that's the kind of debate where I think it can't just happen inside the ADF. It's a constitutional issue. It's also an issue around where we deploy the resources. And you have this wide range of views. Those people who, like Professor White, who says those submarines are our best insurance against territorial invasion. You have people who remember previous conflicts where there was a threat of territorial invasion, and we have our own history of Indigenous our own frontier wars. There's a sensitivity around these issues that requires a really high level and sophisticated debate. So I don't actually have the answer to this one. My preference would be a civilian domestic capacity that had the same high level capabilities. I just know that we don't have that investment and we're unlikely to get it in the short term. So it's time to have some of these debates. So I hope that helps answer your question. So it's a big one.
Susan, your notion of being practical and achieving what we can get and moving incrementally links into the next question, which I'm going to mash together a question from Therese and also from an Al, which is the panel's arguing for a lot of fresh perspectives here. A lot of people have argued for policy and capability changes like these before and have failed against the security establishment. One, how can these ideas succeed where others have failed? And then linking that to Al's question, does the COVID-19 crisis in some way give space for a radical change? I think potentially everyone on the panel will have some really good views on this. So if we maybe just do a 30-second roundup of everyone, starting with Susan, because I can still see you on screen, and then just moving on to the rest.
Sure. Well, it's this issue that you talk about, Katherine, in your paper, this issue of trust. And even though the threats were clear and there's been strategies, there's been hypotheticals and various other things, it's quite different when faced with the reality of disruption. And frankly, it could have been worse. The pandemic and even the bushfires could have been worse. Imagine if we'd been in the middle of those bushfires 1 month later when COVID hit and we got knocked by a cyclone at the same time. It was very, there was all kinds of configurations that could have happened. I do think it opens some space for fresh thinking, just like everyone who can suddenly work online. But, actually, I think it's time for things not to be born of crisis, that there is. Crisis is often a terrible time for diversity of ideas as well. It can really shut down marginalised actors. So I think it's time to really say, okay, these things were predictable. We're just possibly not doing our threat assessments correctly, and we need to start socialising these ideas with the public about what is coming in their future so that it's not such a horrible shock. So we do build this trust and that we can have debates at a pretty sophisticated level. And that people understand the agency they have in order to, that people are always going to be the most important actors in providing their own security. So some of, quite a lot of what our panel is talking about is whose security, when, how. It is about a perspective or a lens that you place on security policy. So I agree with you that these things have been around for a long time. Why haven't they happened? I think it's because it's been too narrow, the constituency for security decision making.
Sara?
Thank you. I would argue actually that I hope I didn't give the impression that we've failed in the health security. I think there have been attempts to try and move this agenda forward. It's been incremental, and some might say it was too little too late in this particular event. But I do think it's worth then taking note of the countries, not just Australia, but other countries that had been very active and proactive campaigners in the last couple of years to focus on health security as a diplomatic and a priority. I would note South Korea, for example, has been a very important actor in the last couple of years after their experience with MERS. So I think sometimes what we don't always pay attention to, understandably, right? There's so many things. We don't always look at the hard work that are being done across a range of other areas. And that perhaps for me is the really important lesson. If we're going to take a lesson out of COVID-19, and it's actually to replicate what Sue was saying, it's really important that we think about, do we have a diversity of voices and experiences? Do we have a diversity of views? And are we challenging what we think we know? And getting comfortable with that, actually, because I think that's one of the things that can be very hard, and particularly in the security realm. It's all about forward posture, using, being able to be ahead of the threat and being able to, demonstrate that you're going to get, put it, in colloquial terms, bang for buck. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is that a lot of, just listening to Katherine, what we're hearing is that what we conceptualize as security, what others conceptualize as a security threat and a security interest, is undergoing some change. I wouldn't say rapid change, but it is undergoing some change. So it just puts the pressure and the focus more on those traditional units like defence, like foreign affairs, to be open to other gazes, other actors, and to be hearing a diversity of views. They still have the choice, they still can make these decisions, and I don't think that's going to change after COVID. But I think what it means, though, is that they need to be more open to a plurality of views.
I want to get our other two panelists' views on this question because I think it's a really good one. I note we're at 6:31, so everyone should feel free to jump out, and if the panelists will indulge me, though, with finishing this question, then perhaps taking one more from the audience, and we might go to Clare next.
Thanks very much, Katherine. I'll be very quick. COVID has highlighted why displaced people, refugees, need lasting solutions. So that means in Australia, we have many thousands of asylum seekers and those who have been found to be refugees who still have insecure legal status and an insecure economic existence that's been exacerbated by COVID. And so the more Australia can do within its borders to give people lasting solutions, then has flow-on effects, as I said in my paper, to ease pressure in other countries that are hosting many more thousands of people. I'll leave it at that.
And Danielle, do you want to dive in?
Sure. So I think going back to what Sara said around the possibility that our institutions might be open to a diversity of views, I think there's two things very quickly that can be said with regards to the question that I'm looking at, which is kind of this big question of nuclear security and human rights. And the first is that as Australia looks towards the region, I think its policy towards North Korea has been very hamstrung by its relationship with the United States and its unwillingness to diverge from that position. And while I'll be speaking to the War College tomorrow actually on Australian public opinion and foreign policy and making the argument that the alliance is as strong as it ever was, I do think that there is the small possibility that there might be some more appetite, perhaps, for looking towards the region, countries like South Korea, for how to deal with North Korea. And then secondly, maybe, just maybe, when the UN puts out its needs and priorities report, that might be taken a little bit more seriously. I mean, it probably won't be, as Sara said, but I think that people are more willing to believe that this is an important security question as well.
Thanks, Danielle. I think I did promise I would let one more question through, and it's going to be another mash-up question of one by Tess, Kane, and one by Sara. And it links actually to what you were just saying, Danielle. So I might actually throw this final question to you, which is, to what extent is Australia being forced by its alliance with the US into thinking more about traditional security matters and in some sense pushing non-traditional but equally important interests out of focus? And linked to that, do we need to perhaps follow the lead of the Pacific Islands Forum take on this, which takes a more human security approach and foregrounds concerns like climate change in particular, but a whole range of other non-traditional threats as well?
I'm not sure I have a lot to add to what I just said, but I wonder if some of the other panelists might. Like Susan.
Just to point out that Osmin, you know, when the ministers for defence meet between the US and Australia, they're already talking about a wide range of things. So even in that most traditional security sort of structures and architecture within the ANZUS alliance, within the Osmin talks, they talk about rare earth minerals, they talk about health, they talk about space, they talk about all kinds of things. So it's there. It's just about, it's about the choices we make. You think of how much intellectual and financial resources we've put into thinking about the South China Sea, and we should, right? But where is the same level of energy and thought around climate change, bushfires, pandemics? You know, it comes, I feel like we're going to have to be more nimble than we are now. We have to be more able to spread our vision across a wider range of things and things that might come to us in a cascade. So I think that's what I'm calling for. Things aren't going to come in boxes, and the timing is going to be extremely difficult. You know, things are going to come all at once, as they always have, right? But I think now in particular, if there's anything the data is telling us, it's a, you know, especially with climate threats, things are speeding up.
Thanks, Susan. I think that's an optimal stopping point for us to end on the notion that we need to approach all of these things with energy and not just think outside and beyond boxes, but also across silos and just deeper and broader across society in general about all of these things. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. A reminder that for those questions we didn't get to, you can always engage on Twitter with us if you would like to pursue the questions that way. We're all there, and we shared our handles earlier, and of course you can have a look at those reports as well on the SDSC website. So we'll end it there. Thanks again everyone, and we look forward to seeing you in some similar forum like this in the future. Good night.